Commander Zexathara stood in the Grand Council chamber, his forearms crossed behind his back as he watched the holographic display showing human military formations. The massive alien warrior had fought in 3 galactic wars and earned 17 battle honors over his 200-year career. His dark blue skin bore the ritual scars of a Caltharian elite soldier, and his yellow eyes held the cold confidence of a veteran who had never lost a battle. The council chamber buzzed with voices from dozens of different alien species, representatives from the mighty Vortakian Empire, the ancient Crystalline Collective, and the proud Zephyrian Federation, all spoke in dismissive tones about the newest addition to their military alliance. The humans had only joined the galactic community 50 years ago, which was barely a moment in time for most of the long-lived species present. Zexathara clicked his mandibles in what passed for laughter among his people. These mammals called humans were small, weak, and short-lived. Their technology looked primitive compared to the energy weapons and shield systems that had dominated galactic warfare for thousands of years. Their ships were smaller than proper warships, and their soldiers carried projectile weapons that seemed almost ancient. "Look at their formations," Ambassador Krelvan from the Zephyrian Federation said, pointing one of his 6 tentacles at the display. "They spread their forces too thin. No proper commander would divide strength like that." General Thoxera from the Vortakian Empire nodded his massive head, making his neck spines rattle. "Their ships lack proper energy shielding. A single plasma cannon burst would destroy 3 of their vessels." Zexathara studied the display more carefully. The human fleet did look odd compared to standard galactic military doctrine. Instead of the tight defensive formations that every military academy taught, human ships scattered across wide areas of space. Their tactics seemed to ignore every rule of proper warfare that civilized species had followed for millennia. In the corner of the chamber sat a small group of humans. They wore simple dark uniforms without the elaborate decorations that most species use to show rank and honor. Lieutenant Colonel Jake Murphy, the human military liaison, listened to the alien discussions with a calm expression on his weathered face. His gray hair and lined skin showed his age, though he was probably less than 60 years old by human standards. Next to Murphy sat Admiral Lisa Carter, the commanding officer of the human fleet. She was younger than Murphy, with short brown hair and sharp green eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Unlike the other species representatives who spoke loudly about their military prowess, the humans remained quiet and watchful. "Perhaps we should not include these humans in our battle plans," suggested Council Leader Vexthul, the ancient head of the War Council. His crystalline form sparkled as he spoke. "Their methods seem too different from proven tactics." Admiral Carter stood up slowly. Her movement was smooth and controlled, like a predator trying not to startle prey. "Council Leader, we would like to request permission to demonstrate our tactical capabilities." The chamber fell silent for a moment. Then several aliens began making sounds that passed for laughter in their species. The idea that these primitive mammals could teach anything to veteran warriors seemed amusing. "Very well," Vexthul said, his crystal body flashing with what might have been humor. "We will observe your demonstration with great interest." Zexathara felt a twinge of something he had not experienced in decades. It might have been curiosity, or perhaps just professional interest in seeing how badly the humans would embarrass themselves. He had commanded fleets in battles that destroyed entire star systems. He had personally led ground assaults against fortress worlds that other species said could never be taken. What could these young mammals possibly show him about warfare? The holographic display changed to show a standard fleet engagement simulation. It was a scenario that every military officer in the galaxy knew well. 2 fleets meeting in open space with the objective of destroying enemy forces while protecting friendly vessels. The rules were simple and had been tested in thousands of real battles over countless years. Admiral Carter began entering commands into her personal display unit. The human ships in the simulation started moving in patterns that made Zexathara's eyes narrow with confusion. Instead of forming the traditional battle line that concentrated firepower and allowed for mutual support, human vessels spread out across an enormous area of space. "What are they doing?" whispered General Thoxera. "They are making themselves vulnerable to concentrated attack," The simulated enemy fleet, programmed with standard galactic tactics, moved to engage the scattered human forces. Any military academy student could predict what would happen next. The enemy would concentrate their firepower on isolated human ships, destroying them one by one before the scattered fleet could provide mutual support. But that was not what happened. The human ships began moving in ways that violated every principle of space combat. Some vessels accelerated directly toward the enemy fleet at speeds that should have been suicidal. Others moved away from the battle, seemingly abandoning their comrades. A few ships began broadcasting signals that made no tactical sense. Zexathara leaned forward, his four hands gripping the edge of his viewing platform. The human tactics looked like chaos, but there was something about their movements that seemed almost coordinated, as if following a plan that he could not understand. The enemy fleet responded exactly as galactic doctrine dictated. They formed a tight formation and began concentrating fire on what appeared to be the most vulnerable human ships. But as soon as they committed to this attack pattern, the scattered human vessels suddenly changed their behavior. Ships that had seemed to be retreating turned back toward the battle at maximum speed. Vessels that had been broadcasting confusing signals revealed that they had been jamming enemy communications. The humans who had charged straight at the enemy fleet were not making suicide runs, but had been drawing enemy fire away from a flanking maneuver that was happening on 3 different sides at once. In less than 20 minutes of simulated combat, the entire enemy fleet was destroyed. The humans had lost only 2 ships and had suffered minimal damage to their remaining vessels. The engagement was over so quickly that several alien observers had not even realized the battle had ended. The council chamber was completely silent. Zexathara stared at the display showing the scattered wreckage of the enemy fleet, while human ships regrouped in formations that still made no sense to his trained military mind. Colonel Murphy stood up and walked to the center of the chamber. His voice was calm and steady as he began to explain what the alien commanders had just witnessed. Our tactical approach focuses on flexibility and adaptation rather than rigid doctrine, he said. We assume that any enemy will expect us to follow standard procedures, so we deliberately do the unexpected. Admiral Carter activated another display that showed detailed analysis of the battle. Human military philosophy emphasizes that the enemy gets a vote in every engagement. No plan survives contact with a thinking opponent, so we train our forces to improvise and adapt in real time. Zexathara felt something cold settle in his stomach as he listened to the human explanations. These were not primitive mammals stumbling through tactics they did not understand. These were experienced warriors who had deliberately chosen to fight in ways that other species would consider impossible or insane. For the first time in his long military career, Commander Zexathara began to wonder if he truly understood warfare at all. 3 weeks later, Zexathara found himself standing on the dusty surface of Zerion Prime, watching human soldiers prepare for what should have been a simple training exercise. The moon's red soil stretched endlessly toward jagged mountains, and the air tasted of metal and ozone from the artificial atmosphere generators. Above them, the planet Zerion cast purple shadows across the landscape. The joint training exercise was designed to test how well different species could work together in real combat situations. The target was a Mach-Vorthan fortress built into the side of a mountain, complete with energy shields, automated defense turrets, and simulated enemy soldiers. Every military academy in the galaxy used similar exercises to teach proper siege warfare. Captain Ben Rodriguez stood next to Zexathara, studying the fortress through electronic binoculars. The human officer was shorter than most aliens but moved with the confidence of someone who had seen real combat. His dark hair was cut short in military style, and his brown eyes never stopped moving as he analyzed the terrain. Standard approach would be to establish fire positions here and here, Zexathara said, pointing with 2 of his forearms toward elevated positions that offered clear sight lines to the fortress. Then advance under covering fire until we breach the outer wall. Rodriguez nodded but did not seem impressed with the plan. That would work, but it would take about 6 hours and cost us maybe 30% casualties. Acceptable losses for a successful assault, Zexathara replied. In his experience, any siege that cost less than 30% was considered a major success. The human captain made a sound that might have been disagreement. "We prefer a different approach." Rodriguez walked over to where his soldiers were, checking their equipment. Unlike the energy weapons that most galactic armies used, the humans carried projectile rifles that fired solid bullets. Their armor looked lighter and less protective than standard military gear, but they moved faster and seemed more comfortable in it. Sergeant Amy Brooks was leading her squad through final equipment checks. She was a small woman with blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, but her soldiers followed her orders without question. Next to her, Corporal Ryan Walsh adjusted the straps on his backpack, which seemed much heavier than necessary for a simple assault. "Brooks, take your team through the front approach," Rodriguez called out. "Walsh, you have the mountain route." Zexthara's mandibles clicked with confusion. The front approach was a killing ground where the fortress guns could destroy any attacking force. The mountain route was impossible terrain that no rational military unit would attempt to cross while carrying full combat gear. "Captain Rodriguez," Zexthara said carefully, "those approaches will result in total casualties for both teams." "Will they?" Rodriguez asked with a slight smile. The exercise began with Zexthara's forces taking the prepared positions and beginning a careful advance under covering fire. It was textbook siege warfare, exactly as he had been taught and had successfully used in dozens of real battles. His soldiers moved forward in careful bounds, using cover and coordinated fire to suppress enemy positions. Meanwhile, Sergeant Brooks led her squad directly toward the main gate of the fortress. They made no attempt to use cover or concealment. Instead, they ran straight across open ground while the automated defense systems opened fire on them. Zexthara watched in horror as energy blasts exploded around the human soldiers. But something was wrong. The humans were not dying as they should have. They moved in patterns that seemed random but kept them just ahead of the tracking systems. When weapons locked onto them, they would suddenly change direction or drop flat, causing the automated guns to fire at empty ground. On the other side of the fortress, Corporal Walsh was leading his team up what appeared to be a vertical cliff face. The humans climbed without ropes or proper equipment, using only their hands and feet to find holds in the rock. It should have been impossible, but they moved up the mountain like they were walking on flat ground. "How are they doing that?" asked Subcommander Vorth, one of Zexthara's junior officers. Zexthara did not have an answer. The humans were performing physical feats that most species would consider beyond their limitations. They were also somehow avoiding defensive fire that should have killed them all within the first few minutes of the assault. Sergeant Brooks reached the main gate and began placing what looked like small packages against the heavy metal doors. The fortress defense systems were still firing at her, but she moved with such unpredictable timing that the automated weapons could not get a proper lock on her position. At the same time, Corporal Walsh's team reached the top of the cliff and began rappelling down the backside of the fortress using ropes they had carried in their heavy packs. They were attacking from a direction that the fortress designers had assumed was impossible to reach. The explosions came simultaneously. Brooks had placed charges that blew the main gate into twisted metal, while Walsh's team destroyed the fortress power generators from inside. In less than 15 minutes, the entire defensive system shut down. "Exercise complete," announced the computer system that monitored the training. "Fortress captured with 0 friendly casualties." Zexthara stared at the smoking ruins of what had been a perfectly designed defensive position. His own forces were still advancing carefully across the open ground, following proper military procedure. The humans had won the battle before his troops had even reached the outer perimeter. Captain Rodriguez walked over with a satisfied expression. "Not bad. We shaved 2 minutes off our last time." "Your soldiers should be dead," Zexthara said, bluntly. "Those were killing grounds. No force should have survived that approach." "You are thinking like the fortress designers," Rodriguez explained. "They built defenses to stop enemies who would attack in predictable ways. We do not attack in predictable ways." Sergeant Brooks joined them, pulling off her helmet to reveal that she was not even breathing hard after her seemingly suicidal run across open ground. The automated systems were programmed to track normal movement patterns. We trained to move in ways that confused their targeting computers. Corporal Walsh appeared from inside the fortress, covered in dust from his climb, but otherwise unharmed. The back approach was marked as impossible on all the tactical maps, so they did not put any real defenses there. Sometimes impossible just means nobody has tried it yet. Zexathera felt something cold crawling up his spine. These humans had not just won the exercise through luck or superior technology. They had analyzed the situation, identified assumptions that their enemies would make, and then deliberately done things that no rational military force would attempt. That evening, as the mixed alien and human forces shared meals in the temporary camp, Zexathara listened to conversations that made his blood run cold. The humans spoke casually about tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare he had ever learned. "Next time we should try the underwater approach," one soldier suggested. "Nobody ever guards the drainage systems." "Remember that siege on Kepler Station?" another human said. "We came through the waste disposal tunnels. Enemy never expected an attack from their own toilets." The aliens at nearby tables grew quiet as they overheard these discussions. The idea of crawling through sewage systems to attack an enemy was something that had never occurred to any of them. It was not just unconventional, it was beneath the dignity of professional soldiers. But as Zexathara watched the humans laugh and plan even more outrageous tactics, he realized that dignity might be a luxury that his species could no longer afford. These mammals did not fight for honor or glory. They fought to win, and they were willing to do absolutely anything that victory required. For the first time in his military career, Commander Zexathara began to understand that he was not the most dangerous warrior in the galaxy. That honor belonged to creatures who thought that crawling through sewage pipes was a perfectly reasonable way to win a battle. The war came 3 months later when the Vorthon Collective launched their invasion of the Outer Rim territories. Zexathara commanded the 3rd Sector Fleet alongside Admiral Frank Patterson, expecting to fight the kind of clean, honorable campaign that had defined galactic warfare for thousands of years. Territory would be taken and lost, resources would be captured or destroyed, and eventually one side would gain enough advantage to force a negotiated peace. But the humans had different plans. From the first day of combat, Admiral Patterson's forces began doing things that made Zexathara's 4 stomachs twist with unease. Instead of engaging Vorthon military forces in open battle, human ships disappeared into deep space and began attacking targets that had nothing to do with the actual war. "They are hitting civilian shipping lanes," reported Subcommander Vorth, his voice filled with confusion. "No military targets, just merchant vessels carrying food and medical supplies." Zexathara studied the tactical display showing red dots where human forces had intercepted Vorthon supply ships. According to every rule of civilized warfare, civilian vessels were off-limits unless they were directly supporting military operations. The Vorthons were following proper protocols by using separate shipping for civilian and military supplies. Admiral Patterson stood beside the display, his gray hair and weathered face showing no emotion as he watched the reports come in. "Every supply ship we stop means fewer resources reaching Vorthon military forces," he said calmly. "Their soldiers need to eat just like anyone else." "But those ships carry food for civilian populations," Zexathara protested. "Children, elderly, non-combatants who have nothing to do with this war." "War is not just about soldiers shooting at each other," Patterson replied. "It is about which society can continue to function under pressure. If Vorthon civilians are hungry, they will pressure their government to end the conflict." Behind them, Major Kate Sullivan was briefing her special operations teams on their next mission. Zexathara had worked with special forces from many species, and they all followed the same basic principles. Infiltrate enemy territory, gather intelligence, sabotage military equipment, and avoid civilian populations whenever possible. The human special forces operated under completely different rules. "Team Alpha will insert here," Sullivan said, pointing to a major Vorthon city that had no military significance. "Your mission is to disrupt civilian communications and transportation. Make sure the population knows that their government cannot protect them from human forces. Team Beta will target the educational networks," she continued. "We want to interrupt the information flow that keeps Vorthon society functioning normally. Create uncertainty, confusion, fear of what might happen next. Zexathara listened to these briefings with growing horror. The humans were not just fighting the Vorthan military. They were attacking the entire Vorthan way of life. They were targeting civilian morale, social structures, and the basic systems that allowed their enemy society to operate. "This is not warfare," he told Patterson after the briefing. "This is something else entirely." "You are right," Patterson agreed. "This is total war. We are not just trying to defeat Vorthan armies. We are trying to convince the entire Vorthan collective that continuing this fight will cost them everything they value." The effectiveness of human tactics became clear within weeks. Vorthan military forces remained strong, but their society began showing signs of stress. Civilian populations could not get reliable news about the war. Transportation systems failed without warning. Food distribution networks experienced mysterious delays. Most disturbing of all, the humans began using psychological warfare on a scale that no galactic civilization had ever attempted. Captain Tony Garcia commanded a destroyer that specialized in electronic warfare, but instead of jamming enemy military communications, his ship broadcast fake news reports throughout Vorthan space. "We are telling Vorthan civilians that their government is losing the war," Garcia explained to Zexathara during a strategy meeting. "We create fake military reports showing massive casualties. We broadcast surrender offers that sound reasonable, but include terms that their leaders could never accept." "But those reports are lies," Zexathara said. "Some of them are lies," Garcia admitted. "Some of them are truth. Some of them are predictions of what will happen if the war continues. The Vorthan population cannot tell the difference, so they assume the worst." Zexathara had never encountered warfare that included deliberate deception on such a massive scale. In traditional galactic conflicts, military commanders might use tactical deception to win specific battles, but they did not attempt to manipulate entire civilian populations with false information. The most shocking example came when Commander Steve Johnson's forces captured a Vorthan research facility. In any normal war, the facility would be destroyed or held as a strategic asset. Instead, the humans began studying Vorthan technology with an intensity that surprised even their allies. "They are reverse engineering everything," reported Chief Science Officer Klex, one of Zexathara's technical advisors. "Weapons, communications equipment, even civilian technology. They are learning how to build Vorthan systems better than the Vorthans themselves." Within days, human forces were using modified Vorthan technology against its creators. They took enemy communication codes and used them to send false orders to Vorthan military units. They analyzed Vorthan weapons and developed countermeasures that made their own defenses nearly perfect. But the most disturbing development came when the humans began using captured Vorthan technology to impersonate Vorthan forces. Human ships began broadcasting Vorthan identification codes and using Vorthan military protocols to approach enemy positions. "This is a violation of the Galactic Convention on Warfare," Zexathara protested to Admiral Patterson. "Combatants must clearly identify themselves. Deception on this scale is considered a war crime by most civilized species." Patterson looked at him with tired eyes. "Commander, the Galactic Convention assumes that all species fight wars the same way. It assumes that everyone follows the same rules because everyone has the same limitations. Humans do not have those limitations." "What do you mean?" "Most species are not willing to sacrifice everything to win a war. Most species value honor, tradition, and the opinions of other civilizations. Most species fight wars to achieve specific political goals, not to completely destroy their enemies." Patterson turned back to the tactical display, showing the progression of human operations throughout Vorthan space. Humans fight wars to solve problems. The Vorthan started this war, so they became a problem that needs to be solved. We will use any method necessary to solve that problem permanently. That night, Zexathara lay in his quarters thinking about conversations he had overheard between human soldiers. They spoke casually about tactics that would have horrified military academies throughout the galaxy. They discussed targeting civilian infrastructure not just to weaken enemy logistics, but to create refugees who would burden enemy resources. They planned information campaigns designed to turn Vorthon civilians against their own government. They developed strategies to make Vorthon soldiers question whether their cause was worth fighting for. They created psychological pressure that would make the enemy population demand peace at any price. The humans were not just fighting a war against Vorthon military forces. They were fighting a war against the entire concept of Vorthon civilization continuing to exist in its current form. For the first time in his 200-year military career, Commander Zexathara understood that he was witnessing something that the galaxy had never seen before. The humans were not trying to win a war in any traditional sense. They were trying to remake their enemies completely, to transform them into something that could never threaten anyone again. And they were succeeding. The final assault on the Vorthon homeworld began 6 months after the war started, but by then Zexathara knew that the real battle was already over. He stood in the command center of the massive Allied fleet, watching Admiral Patricia Davis explain the human battle plan to the assembled alien commanders. What he heard made his blood freeze in his veins. Phase 1 involves complete isolation of the planet, Davis said, her voice calm and professional as she outlined what sounded like the systematic destruction of an entire civilization. We cut all communication with the outside galaxy. No signals in, no signals out. The Vorthon population will lose contact with their colonial worlds and trading partners. General Thaxara from the Vortakian Empire shifted uncomfortably. Admiral, that will cause panic among civilian populations. They will not understand why they have been cut off from their families and businesses. That is the point, Davis replied without emotion. Fear and uncertainty will pressure the Vorthon government to negotiate. People make different choices when they are afraid. Zexathara studied the tactical display showing the positions of human ships around the Vorthon homeworld. There were fewer human vessels than alien ships, but they were positioned in ways that controlled every approach to the planet. The humans had not brought the largest fleet, but they had brought the most strategically placed one. Phase 2 begins psychological operations, continued Colonel Danny Foster, Davis's chief of staff. We will broadcast information into Vorthon population centers explaining exactly what will happen if their government does not surrender. We will be very specific about the consequences of continued resistance. What kind of consequences? Asked Ambassador Krelvan, his tentacles writhing with nervousness. Foster activated a new display showing detailed plans for what humans called economic warfare. The scope of it took Zexathara's breath away. The humans had mapped every aspect of Vorthon society and identified exactly how to break it without firing a single shot at military targets. We will explain that their banking systems will be permanently disrupted, Foster said. Their trade networks will be destroyed. Their food distribution systems will stop working. Their medical facilities will lose access to imported supplies. Their transportation networks will be shut down. But that will affect millions of civilians, protested Council Leader Vexthul. Children, elderly, innocent people who have nothing to do with military decisions. Yes, Foster agreed. That is what will make it effective. The Vorthon government will have to choose between continuing a war they cannot win or protecting their own people from suffering. Captain Michelle Brooks stepped forward to explain Phase 3, which was even more disturbing than the first two phases. She was a small woman with short red hair, but her green eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had thought deeply about how to destroy entire civilizations. We will demonstrate our ability to reshape Vorthon society by targeting their information networks, she said. We will take control of their news services, their educational systems, their entertainment media, and their government communications. The display showed how human computer specialists had already infiltrated Vorthon networks during the past months of warfare. They had not just gained access to military systems. They had quietly taken control of civilian infrastructure throughout Vorthon space. We will use their own communication systems to broadcast new information, Brooks continued. History lessons that show how Vorthon aggression led to this war. Economic data that proves their society cannot survive continued conflict. Cultural programs that promote cooperation with galactic neighbors instead of military expansion. Zexathara, realized that the humans were not planning to conquer the Vorthan homeworld in any traditional sense. They were planning to transform Vorthan civilization from the inside, using the Vorthan's own systems against them. It was not military conquest, it was cultural conversion on a scale that no species had ever attempted. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Stevens explained the final phase, which would only be implemented if the Vorthans continued to resist after the first 3 phases were complete. His presentation made every alien commander in the room step back in horror. Phase 4 involves complete social restructuring, Stevens said matter-of-factly. We will partition Vorthan territory into smaller regions that cannot support large military forces. We will relocate population centers to break up traditional social structures. We will establish new educational systems that teach cooperation instead of aggression. You are talking about destroying the Vorthan species as it currently exists, Zexathera said, his voice barely above a whisper. We are talking about helping the Vorthan species become something better, Stevens corrected. Something that can coexist peacefully with the rest of the galaxy. Admiral Davis stepped back to the center of the room. The choice is entirely up to the Vorthan government. They can surrender now and negotiate terms that preserve their basic way of life. Or they can continue fighting and force us to implement social changes that will be much more dramatic. The alien commanders looked at each other with expressions of shock and disbelief. They had expected to hear about military tactics and battle plans. Instead, they had heard about the systematic transformation of an entire civilization. What if they choose to fight to the death rather than surrender? Asked General Thoxera. Davis shrugged. Then they will discover that humans are very good at managing the aftermath of civilizational collapse. We have experience rebuilding societies from the ground up. The battle, when it came, was nothing like the epic space conflicts that had defined galactic warfare for thousands of years. The Vorthan fleet launched from their homeworld expecting to meet the Allied forces in open combat. Instead, they found that their ships could not communicate with each other or with ground control. Their weapon systems were disrupted by signals that their own technology was broadcasting. Their navigation computers were receiving false information that led them away from their intended targets. Within hours, the entire Vorthan fleet was either destroyed or had surrendered without firing a single effective shot. The humans had used 6 months of preparation to ensure that the enemy could not fight even if they wanted to. Captain Alex Turner, commanding one of the human destroyers, reported to Admiral Davis with casual satisfaction. Enemy fleet neutralized. No human casualties. Vorthan survivors are requesting permission to discuss surrender terms. The war ended not with a climactic battle but with a simple communication from the Vorthan government requesting immediate ceasefire negotiations. They had realized that continuing to fight would result in the complete destruction of everything they valued about their civilization. 3 days later, Zexathara attended the surrender ceremony on the Vorthan homeworld. He watched Vorthan leaders sign documents that essentially gave humans control over their society's future development. The terms were not harsh by historical standards, but they were complete. The Vorthans would rebuild their civilization according to human guidelines that emphasized cooperation, trade, and peaceful resolution of disputes. After the ceremony, Zexathara found himself standing next to Colonel Jennifer Scott, who had played a key role in the psychological operations that had made Vorthan resistance impossible. She was a quiet woman with brown hair and intelligent eyes who had spent months studying Vorthan culture to understand exactly how to break their will to fight. You did not just defeat them, Zexathara said. You remade them completely. We solved the problem they represented, Scott replied. The Vorthan started this war because they believed military aggression was an acceptable way to get what they wanted. Now they understand that aggression leads to consequences they cannot accept. That night, as Zexathara prepared his final report to the Keltharian High Command, he tried to find words to describe what he had witnessed. The humans had not just won a war. They had demonstrated a form of warfare that made traditional military thinking obsolete. His report contained a single recommendation: never fight humanity, and never give them a reason to fight without restraint. The galaxy had room for only one species that waged war the way humans did, and every other civilization's survival depended on staying on their good side. In his private quarters, Zexathera kept a human military manual as a reminder of what he had learned. The title read, Basic Psychological Operations, and it represented the most terrifying document in his collection. If this was what humans considered basic tactics, he never wanted to see what they would do in a war where they felt truly threatened.